What people have worn throughout time is a vast subject and is highly influential and important to society. Fashion design has always been a connected progression of changing trends and styles, and these changes have been strongly influenced by events in history. In this video, we're going to look at the major trends in fashion from around 1800 to 1950 and the ways history has impacted these trends. Along the way, we'll see how fashion affects history and culture as well. Women in the 1800s typically owned different gowns for various events and times of day. Other than this similarity, there was much diversity in style over this century. Style in the early 1800s began with long, flowy gowns that resembled Greek or Roman dress. The 1810s and 1820s, which was the beginning of the Romantic era, transitioned to dresses with more structure and details. Around this time, gigot sleeves, which were ginormous puffy sleeves, were very popular. The 1830s began the Victorian era of fashion. This era included most of the time that Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, was Queen of England. She was an important influence of fashion at this time, and she set the trend for a bride to wear a white wedding dress. The Victorian era introduced clothing that was supported by many layers, which meant that extensive amounts of fabrics were needed. One event that affected this period was the Industrial Revolution. Investors in this movement became part of the upper class who could own expensive clothing. Later, the production of sewing machines made clothing faster to make and cheaper to buy. The 1830s and 1840s marked the beginning of the popularity of tight corsets used to feign a tiny waist. The bell-shaped skirt became progressively larger, and many layers of petticoats underneath the skirt were needed for support. In the 1850s, crinolines and hoop skirts were created to bring extra volume to skirts that could not be made by only petticoats. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, influenced men's clothing of these past 2 decades. Men wore tight trousers and waistcoats and long fitted frock coats. The bowler hat arose in the 1850s but was seen as a working class hat, whereas the top hat was worn by the upper class. In 1865, the size of the skirt began to decline, and the bustle in the back of the skirt became more popular. These new designs were partially inspired by Charles Worth. This designer is called the father of haute couture, or higher fashion. Haute couture houses were shops where clients could get clothing specially fitted for themselves. From the 1870s to 1880s, the bustle grew to be extremely exaggerated, and frills, folds, and laces were all the rage. At this point, corsets became extremely and painfully tight. Soon the bustle declined, and in the 1890s there was a resurgence of the gigot sleeves. Men's fashion at this time popularized lounge suits. A necktie similar to the bow tie appeared, and collars became very stiff and high. The poor of the Victorian era had hardly any of these luxurious fashions. Many people would wear hand-me-downs, rags, or stolen clothing. Women and children could not afford shoes often, and sometimes men could get used shoes. The 1900s popularized the S-bend corset and slim skirts with trains in the back. These trends were soon replaced by the ideas of Paul Poiret, a Parisian fashion designer. In his time, slimmer skirts and the empire waist were brought to the scene, and corsets were loosened. In the 1910s, the World War caused women to start wearing practical, durable working clothes, and sometimes uniforms. Driving clothes were also needed when cars were invented, and the bob hairstyle started to develop at the end of the century. Although the general fashion for men was the 3-piece lounge suit, men often wore uniforms during this time because of World War I. In the 1920s, waistlines dropped and dresses became loose and light. Fashion tended toward simplicity, but dresses often featured embroidery or beading. Jewelry was very popular, along with a bell-shaped hat called a cloche hat. The Great Depression greatly influenced the clothing of the 1930s because of widespread poverty. People could buy factory-made clothing or sew their own dresses. Beginning in this time, people began to be influenced in their fashion decisions by what they saw in Hollywood movies. Fashion in the 1940s was significantly impacted by the Second World War. Many men and women wore uniforms in this time. This created a trend of wide-shouldered jackets and shorter skirts for women, and working women even began to wear trousers. Because of fabric limitation during the war, the style was very simple. When the war ended, men started to wear the demob or demobilization suit given to them after they had fought in the war. Finally, in the 1950s, a trend of normal shoulder emphasis and larger skirts developed. The pencil skirt also became very popular. Dresses and skirts could have monochromatic floral or tweed patterns. As we can see, history directly influences fashion, and in turn, fashion creates cultures that reflect people's values and lives. For example, the 1920s was a time where people were wildly celebrating the war being over, and this mentality was clearly reflected in the fashion of this time. Changes in style also came as women's rights grew and as women entered the workplace. With growing technology and media, people in the 20th century started looking to advertisements and Hollywood stars for fashion ideas. Fashion often creates rifts between social classes as well. Fashion is constantly being molded and transformed by history, and in turn, fashion shapes culture and society. Thanks for watching.